What's up, guys? I'm Chris Spags here, back to another Four Corners video breaking down tonight's already chaotic NBA slate, courtesy of Osmo.com. Now, today's already been stressful, and I had to re-record part of the video because of some important news that came through. So make sure to like the video right now. Leave a comment telling me, because of all the news that we've had, which player on the slate you like the most who's been affected by some of the changes going on. We have Kevin Durant out, Paul George out. So like the video right now. Leave a comment. Helps me out quite a bit, and also helps my sanity because this has been a lot of work for a video which is going to be just about 10 minutes long. The first corner I want to hit on is a game of the Sixers and the Thunder, and this one is a 239-point total, which at least as of right now is the highest on the slate. The number could go down a little bit because of Paul George being ruled out, but at least currently it represents a 7.1-point boost for the Thunder and a 0.3-point boost for the Philadelphia 76ers. As I mentioned, Paul George is out with shoulder issues. That affects everything because he did look like a great play, which is why he now has that little Ghostbuster sign on him in the video that you can see. But he is out of the game, so going to mean a boost for Russell Westbrook most likely. On a per-minute basis, Westbrook doesn't gain a lot with Paul George off the court, but in order to stay in this game versus the Sixers team who can put up some points, you have to assume Russell Westbrook's going to drive the action. He's also going to push that usage rate up more. He's going to shoot probably more than he has recently because he has been deferring a lot to Paul George. So Russell Westbrook, to me, looks like pretty close to a must-play. The replacement starter for Paul George is also a key for me because in previous times where Paul George has been out, they haven't had Markieff Morris available, and I think Markieff Morris could do a reasonable impression of what Paul George does, obviously not with as much success. He's nowhere near as good of a player, but he can put up some threes, he can shoot a bunch, he can play a little bit of defense. So I think Markieff Morris, if he starts, becomes a very interesting play. If it does go the way that it has in the past, Dennis Schroeder, also an interesting play. He's averaged 1.13 fantasy points per minute in games without Paul George, or situations without Paul George so far on the court. So I think Dennis Schroeder looks like a good play, but Markieff Morris, if he does start, or even if he doesn't start, a pretty interesting tournament play for me, especially if people don't pick up on him. Steven Adams also should see some more scoring opportunity without Paul George, some more pick and pops, some more rim runs. I think he's got a decent shot at scoring a bit more there. So Steven Adams is interesting. There is some risk. Nerlens Noel has been coming for his minutes, and Nerlens Noel also could be a guy who picks up minutes that Paul George leaves behind. So I think that concerns me a little bit, but overall, Adams like a good play, and definitely a better play because of George being on the sidelines. Ben Simmons put up 52.75 fantasy points in this matchup versus Oklahoma City earlier this year, and while past results are not necessarily an indicator of future success, I think the matchup does bode well for him, especially if this total does stay pretty high. He's going to have to do some extra assist upside, going to have to also score on his own as well. So Ben Simmons, to me, looks like the best play on the Sixers side. Tobias Harris is expected to have less ownership than Jimmy Butler right now. Jimmy Butler projected for 28% ownership. And though his shot hasn't fallen in the last 2 out of 3 games, he's been 5 for 16, 5 for 14 in 2 out of those last 3. Butler just worries me a little bit. He's had the 7th highest usage rate since Tobias Harris joined the team. 7th highest usage rate on the Sixers, that is. So obviously Jimmy Butler not really pushing the scoring opportunities as much as it should. I think if he's going to be around 28%, 30% ownership, I'd rather get half the ownership on Tobias Harris, given the fact that he's been over 40 fantasy points in 3 out of his last 4 games. So I prefer Harris slightly, but I think I want to come close to the field on Butler because he's shooting enough to get there. It's just a question of whether he can. And if he does have that big day, it would be really bad to miss out on it on a slate of this size, especially when you know how high this team total is. JJ Redick has a questionable ceiling to me, and we haven't seen his usage trickle up too much higher, even with Joel Embiid's sideline. But Redick looks like a good play, a guy who I worry if he has enough tournament upside to win you one of the big ones. But overall, Redick a fine play and a guy who I think is worth having in some degree of lineups. And the last Sixer I'd want to mention, Mike Scott has been over 30 minutes in the last 2 games. I think that bodes well for him. There is some risk Jonah Bolden takes some minutes back, or a new addition from the previous trade of Jimmy Butler, Justin Patton, who's expected to be in the rotation soon, or at least have a shot to be in the rotation. He could take some minutes away. So I think there's some risk with Mike Scott, but 30 minutes in 2 straight games is hard to ignore, and I think he could have some scoring upside here. Next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Heat visiting the Rockets. This one is a 220-point combined total, and that represents a 1.5-point boost for Houston. The next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Heat visiting the Rockets. This one has a 220-point total, and that represents a 1.2-point boost for Houston. Bam Adebayo is the first guy you have to talk about here. He's projected to be owned by 58% of people in the field today. Honestly, I don't see any issue with it at all. Bam Adebayo is a guy I loaded up on yesterday. He ended up doing great. I think some people had concerns about the Warriors matchup for him, but I think Bam Adebayo is just a guy who gets there night in, night out, as long as he avoids foul trouble. So I'm okay with Bam. I will probably be exactly with the field with Bam, maybe honestly a little bit higher because his value is really hard to avoid when we need to cram in some higher priced guys. So Bam Adebayo, a guy I would say better than not. And the reason to not play him is just to differentiate your lineup. And I would prefer to keep my lineup close and differentiate elsewhere personally. Dwayne Wade really killed it yesterday in that game versus the Warriors, but I think the question is whether there's some letdown risk for him. We saw him really push that usage up, shoot some threes. He hit the game-winning three as well. Now they're on the road on a back-to-back in Houston. This is Dwayne Wade's last game in Houston and his one last dance tour, as he so graciously called it. So I think that could maybe bounce out a little bit, but I worry about the back-to-back for an old player. I worry about just the emotional letdown of beating the Warriors in that tight of a game. So those parts concern me a little bit, but I think Dwayne Wade still got to have in some lineups because he's just been playing really well. Kelly Olynyk's minutes have been there around 30 minutes. James Johnson's still out. Hassan Whiteside's still out. So I think Kelly Olynyk is a perfectly fine play. He's got tournament upside. He also has tournament downsides. He may just be bad chalk. But overall, Kelly Olynyk, I think, is a guy who is going to be a viable enough play to have tonight. Josh Richardson and Justice Winslow both project as being solid, but mostly unspectacular to me. Josh Richardson had one big day versus Houston earlier this year, 41.5 fantasy points, but Winslow's cheaper, so I could see them both having their pluses and minuses. I'd prefer Richardson. I was encouraged by the fact that despite Goran Dragic having this big scoring day off the bench, we still saw Josh Richardson have one of his best days in a while. So I'm comfortable with Josh. I think that Justice Winslow, though, might be a slightly better play because of the price. Overall, though, it's probably a wash between the two guys. So I'd slightly favor Josh, but honestly, either guy you're going to be okay with. James Harden really hasn't looked full strength recently with his neck problems. From a fantasy perspective and in a game watch perspective, just not seeing the same enthusiasm for scoring that he's had previously, even though the shot attempts have been there. He's an interesting contrarian play, but the Heat are only giving up 44.7% shooting from the floor, which is lowest on the slate. So there are some risks with Harden. I think if you're going to him, you are going to pass up then likely Jokic. You're going to pass up Westbrook, who we talked about as for me being close to a must play. You're going to pass up Karl-Anthony Towns, who could be a must play as well if Jeff Teague is out again. So there's some risk going to Harden, but some upside as well because he does have that crazy ceiling, which we have seen enough times this year to know he can break a tournament slate. Clint Capella had his best game since returning from injury in that last game yesterday versus the Hornets. He put up 16 shots and 17 boards en route to 52.75 fantasy points. This isn't a great matchup to do it again, but he does have 23% ownership expected of him, so I think that's a pretty fair number to have on Clint Capella. I don't know that he's going to maintain that much of a role, but this price being down makes him a little more appealing as well. So Clint Capella looks fine to me, but this is a tough Heat matchup again for pretty much everybody on the Rockets side. And Chris Paul is expected to be under 5% ownership, which is always appealing for Chris Paul because he does have some upside. But a back-to-back for an older player who's had some hamstring issues, not really a spot I'm dying to get to. If you want to get above the field, go 10% and go double the field then. That'd be great. But I wouldn't load up on Chris Paul, even though he seems like an okay enough play. Next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Cavs visiting the Knicks. This one has a 218.5 combined total, which represents a 4.3 point boost for Cleveland and a 5.1 point boost for the Knicks. Kevin Love expected to have about 20% ownership, and with his minutes in the high 20s / low 30s, I think he's going to be in a really good spot here and has some crazy upside. Again, the Knicks just allowing a ton of field goals, a ton of rebounds. It's a really good spot for Kevin Love to have that ceiling game, which he hasn't had since getting back from injury. So overall, I think with his minutes probably on the rise with his minutes restriction, I think Love is in a really nice spot, and I'll definitely be at probably above the field on him. Cedi Osman's actually averaged 38 fantasy points when he's been getting over 31 minutes recently, and that's happened in 7 out of the last 10 games. So you know if Cedi Osman's getting the minutes, he's probably going to have a good day. He's only had one pretty poor day out of that grouping when he did get 31 minutes. So overall, Cedi Osman to me is a guy who's probably going to go under-recognized on the slate, but he does look like a good play versus this Knicks team who gives up a ton of peripherals across the board, and Cedi Osman is a guy who can grab them. Colin Sexton and Jordan Clarkson are fairly similar plays to me. They're both scoring-dependent guys who are going to need to get going in order to hit fantasy value. Sexton's role is pretty secure, whereas Jordan Clarkson's, he needs to heat up in order to see enough minutes to even have a shot at hitting value. But Sexton is a guy who intrigues me a bit. He's a young guy coming to the Garden for the first time. He's a guy who clearly has a little bit of an ego to him because he shoots with no shame at all. So overall, Colin Sexton, an interesting play. Jordan Clarkson, interesting as well. You could convince me on either of those guys. Ante Zizic is going to get the first shot at these Knicks, assuming that he continues to start. And that, to me, makes him an interesting play. The Knicks, one of the worst rebounding teams in the league, giving up 47.9 boards per game. Mitchell Robinson going to close that up a little bit, but still offers enough opportunity for somebody to get going. So Ante Zizic, interesting. His very existence also makes Larry Nance pretty unplayable to me. I think Nance is an interesting tournament option. Again, if Zizic falters and just gets gobbled up by Mitchell Robinson, you could see Larry Nance come in, a more veteran hand, to have to keep Mitchell Robinson in bay. But overall, I think Zizic getting the first opportunity at a cheap price, an interesting situation rotation to target. On the Knicks side, the first guy you have to look at is Henry Ellenson after that monster performance he had in his first time getting run as a Knick. He's been a good per minute player his career. I think the fact that he had 11 shots, 3 for 6 from 3, also rebounded, put up some assists and steals in that game, that all bodes well for Ellenson as a great per minute guy across the floor. Great might have been a strong word, but a good per minute guy. Great for how he looks. I think that's what I could say about Henry Ellenson. But overall, I think he looks like a strong play tonight, assuming he gets the minutes. And I think his minutes are actually going to have a decent shot coming to fruition. There's always some risk. It's the Knicks. They are a team who will just kick you in the nards over and over and over again. But Henry Ellenson, to me, is a guy who I will have some exposure to and probably be a little bit above the field on, because I liked what I saw. And I think David Fizdale will reward him, because the other guys who have played that role that he took over have not been that great. But a guy who has been great is Mitchell Robinson. He's been a guy also, his role seems steady. He hasn't started yet, but he has gotten big minutes. I like his opportunity here. The Cavs have been good versus bigs. They've been good at limiting the damage that a big can do on the boards and as a block machine, which two things that Mitchell Robinson really relies on to hit value. But I think Mitchell Robinson's good enough to get those things going. So I'm cool with being where the field is. The field's at about 10% right now. Might be a little higher than that, because I think Mitchell Robinson is a good play with some real upside. But overall, you can at least bank on him having a role where Fizdale wants to give him minutes, and that's a positive in this Knicks rotation. Now, the exact opposite applies for the backcourt and the wings for the Knicks. Recently, Emmanuel Mudiay and Alonzo Trier have been the hot hands, and that, to me, based on what we know of David Fizdale, which is a complete lack of logic, a complete lack of flow, of letting guys continue to build and get better, it might be a time to go to Damian Dotson or to go to Dennis Smith. I think either of those guys are going under-recognized right now, and they could be the hot hand. They could be spurred on by losing minutes to Trier and to Mudiay, so it's all really stupid, honestly, and you can go with any of these guys if you want. None of them are projecting crazily for me, but I think if you want to be contrarian and you want to play inside the crazy mind of David Fizdale, who thinks he's a really great coach and he's really a questionably good coach at best, I think then go to the guys who are playing poorly and hope they somehow succeed. The last corner I want to hit on is a game of the Warriors visiting the Magic. This one is a 226.5 combined total, and that represents a 4.3 point boost for Orlando. Kevin Durant's been ruled out of this one for the Warriors, and that's just going to mean a usage boost for everybody. Again, Kevin Durant, a scorer who's going to score a lot, so his shots being out of the rotation, everybody gets a little more. DeMarcus Cousins is the only rested Warrior because the Warriors are on a back-to-back. He was out yesterday, so I think he's going to be in a good spot regardless, but he's now in a really good spot. He's averaged 1.48 fantasy points per minute in court time without Kevin Durant. He's been really succeeding well. He's had really good fantasy upside, even though his price is pretty high. He's actually beaten that price with his upside in the last couple games. So overall, I like DeMarcus Cousins quite a bit today, and if he's going to go low-owned, which we currently have him as, I think it's a really nice spot to go to him, and people may not be on him as much as they should. And of course, while we're talking about all this extra usage flowing around, Steph Curry and Klay Thompson will pick up quite a bit of that usage as Kevin Durant leaves behind. They both also have benefited on a per minute basis from Durant being out of the lineup. Steph Curry goes from 1.38 points per minute, fantasy points per minute, to 1.47. Klay Thompson goes from 1.02 fantasy points per minute to 1.25 in court time without Kevin Durant. So everything checks out the way you would think it was. They're going to get some more shots, going to get some more rebounds, some more playmaking, some more time with the ball. All of that matters. So Steph Curry, Klay Thompson definitely becoming better plays. I think all three, them and DeMarcus Cousins, all should benefit quite a bit from Kevin Durant being out. Draymond Green was perhaps the most affected by the Miami nightlife yesterday. Had a really terrible day. Today he's under just 5% ownership. It's a decent bounce back spot for him, I think, overall. Not a guy I'm as crazy about as Curry, Durant, and Cousins, but a guy who I think is worth having some exposure to. So Draymond Green, a good bounce back spot, very low ownership. All that checks out. Nikola Vucevic had 57.5 fantasy points versus Golden State earlier this year, and though DeMarcus Cousins being close to full strength should impede that a little bit more, I think Vucevic still looks like a good play. He's been over 53 fantasy points in his last 3 games, just very steady. His price is down a little bit as well, so if the Magic are going to keep this one competitive or have a shot at winning this one, a lot of it's probably going to come from Nikola Vucevic. Evan Fournier and Aaron Gordon are very likely going to have to score at a decent clip to keep up with the Warriors. Even though they are on a back-to-back, the Warriors are still very capable of putting up a ton of points, even versus a Magic team who's pretty good defensively. So I think Evan Fournier and Aaron Gordon be the first two guys to look at there. I think I would slightly prefer Aaron Gordon, just a little more athleticism to get his shot, which I think will help him out. Evan Fournier, still a perfectly fine play, but that athleticism boost for Gordon gives me a little more interest in him. And again, I would watch out for Terrence Ross too in the second unit, because the Warriors are still pretty good defensively in that first unit group. Even with Kevin Durant out, I think they'll be decent enough defensively where they could impede progress. And Terrence Ross coming off of a terrible, terrible game. Again, Terrence Ross is human whack-a-mole. Shot 1 for 10 and 5 fantasy points in that last game, but would it shock you to see 40 fantasy points today? Certainly wouldn't shock me. So Terrence Ross at 1% ownership right now, I think a pretty decent play and a viable pivot to the Fournier and Gordon duo. And DJ Augustin as well should be affected a bit by that Warriors D. His assist upside, I'd imagine, would be cut into a little bit because the Warriors are going to close out on shots pretty effectively. But he can get it going. I think he's a good play. I don't know that I trust his ability to create his own shot, but if these other guys are hitting their shots, that'll make some more room for him to operate. So DJ Augustin to me is a contingent play where if I think these other guys are going to play well in a lineup, then I'll have DJ Augustin in there as well, kind of riding the tide to success. There we go. Those are my thoughts on today's NBA slate. So make sure to like the video right now. Leave a comment down below. Tell me which player you like the most now as a result of all this chaotic NBA news affecting everything and affecting my morning in a really way that I don't appreciate NBA players. So get well, everybody. Make this easier on me. But also, make sure to use the promo code Switch and Hedge. We're going to drop it in right here. That'll give you 50% off your first month at Awesemo.com. All the ownership projections and rankings from Awesemo, who is the top player in the world, will help you out quite a bit in building lineups, as well as access to the premium Slack. A lot of people in there talking all day. A lot of us on the staff as well coming in, discussing, answering questions. So go ahead, use that promo code Switch and Hedge for 50% off your first month. And that's everything I have to talk about today. So let's hope there's no injury news that completely ruins this video the second after I edit and publish it, but I'll be back again tomorrow with another Four Corners video, so good luck tonight.